Good evening, everyone. I am Peggy Edersheim-Kalb, a member of the Greenwich Library Board of Trustees. I'm delighted to welcome you to a special ReConnect event, part of the celebration of the recently completed 18-month renovation to reimagine, renew, and repurpose our beautiful library. We are delighted to welcome you to what we know will be a fascinating conversation about the nature of the future with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Elizabeth Kolbert, and author, environmentalist, and activist Bill McKibben. Journalist and author Mark Hertsgaard will be our moderator. The conversation will center on Kolbert's new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. So pervasive are human impacts on the planet that it's said we live in a new geological age, the Anthropocene. In her work, Kolbert takes a hard look at this new world we are creating. She meets scientists who are trying to preserve the world's rarest fish which live in a single tiny pool in the middle of the Mojave. She visits a lava field in Iceland where engineers are turning carbon emissions to stone, an aquarium in Australia where researchers are trying to develop super coral that can survive on a warmer globe, and she visits a Harvard lab where physicists are contemplating shooting tiny diamonds into the stratosphere in order to reflect sunlight back to space and cool the Earth. Bill McKibben is the founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book on climate change intended for a general audience, and it has been translated into 24 languages. His most recent book, Falter, came out in 2019. Mark Hertsgaard is the executive director of Covering Climate Now, a global journalism initiative committed to more and better coverage of the climate story. He is also the environment correspondent for The Nation and author of books including Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. And now I'm honored to introduce Mark Hertsgaard.
Thank you, Peggy, and hello, everybody, and welcome to this evening. It is my great pleasure to be here with you and with two of my oldest colleagues, Betsy Kolbert and Bill McKibben. I hope that everyone recognizes just how fortunate you are this Earth Day week to have these two writers speaking to you. These are, Bill and Betsy are two of the most experienced, clear-eyed, and influential writers on climate change anywhere around. And I have to say, whoever is organizing the events for the Greenwich Library must have the golden touch to be able to get both of them on the same night. And I'm very honored to be here with you. I should start by emphasizing that I have known Bill and Betsy for many years, Bill especially since our days back at the New Yorker magazine years ago. And each of us was a reporter before we began writing books, and we remain reporters today. So I hope that everyone will allow me this indulgence as a reporter and as the moderator to begin with the news of the day, the news that I'm sure is on everyone's mind, which is the 3 guilty verdicts for the police officer, Derek Chauvin, for the murder of George Floyd. That subject is not as far away from our purported topic tonight as one might think. When Mr. Floyd was killed last May, it was very striking as a climate reporter to see that many climate activist groups, including the Sunrise Movement, Bill's organization 350.org, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, issued statements of solidarity and urged their members to go out and join the protest marches. That would have been inconceivable from environmental groups just a few short years ago. And I'd like to begin, therefore, to ask, and Bill, I'm going to start with you because of your role at 350. What are the connections between racial justice and climate justice, and how is today's verdict likely to affect that work going forward? Let's get you mic'd up there first.
Can you hear me now, Mark?
Yeah, that's good.
It's a very good question. And first of all, what a pleasure to be with you and with Betsy and to be able to celebrate her new book, which is a remarkable book, and I'm so eager to talk about it. But there is no avoiding this question today. And it's been a very interesting, painful, powerful year since George Floyd's murder. A real shout out to my colleagues at Minnesota 350 who were in the lead, Sam Grant there in the lead of doing a lot of the organizing. Look, the most important thing anybody said in 2020 was what he said as he was being killed: I can't breathe. And people can't breathe because there's a racist cop kneeling on their neck. And as activists immediately started pointing out in those communities, people can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power plant down the street, and it's always the same street. African Americans have 3 times the asthma rate of white Americans, not because of anything to do with physiology, everything to do with geography. People can't breathe because the governors told them that the wildfire smoke is so bad they got to go in their house and tape the windows shut. You know, people can't breathe because it gets too hot. We set last summer, while all that was going on, the new record on this planet Earth for the hottest temperature we've ever recorded, 130 degrees in California. That's at the edge of human ability to survive, but it's going to be big swaths of the world like that very soon unless we get our act together very fast. And so I think there's no escaping the fact that all of this is bound up in questions of justice at the utter root. You know, the great iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit by it. And that just the same people who get hit by everything over and over and over again. And today's verdict doesn't really feel like justice exactly, but at least it feels like some beginning of accountability, some truth telling anyway. And truth telling is what we have to offer as writers and journalists, and also to some degree as activists. And so so it's appropriate too that I guess we come together tonight to talk, even in the wake of this that really has well, it's filled all our hearts and minds today.
Thank you. That's Bill McKibben speaking about the trial, the verdict that for anyone who has not heard, a jury in Minneapolis found that Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer, guilty on all 3 counts for the murder of George Floyd. Elizabeth Kolbert, could you expand on this a little bit? I'm just going to hold up here a copy of your book. Anybody who has not read this yet, I highly recommend it. Betsy and I have already done one Zoom call about this. We had a long conversation about Under a White Sky, which kind of takes climate reporting to the next level and talks about the various ways that humanity through history has tried to manipulate nature, and then when nature doesn't quite obey itself, obey humanity, we try to manipulate it again. So from that big, almost universal perspective, Betsy, could you talk about your reaction to the verdicts today and how you see that fitting in to the topic of tonight's conversation?
Well, I was, I guess, inappropriately driving when I heard the verdict being read, which was a really surprisingly emotional experience, just such a powerful experience to hear the judge read out that verdict. I wouldn't have even necessarily expected that it would hit me that hard. But no one can do better than Bill, really, to express the connections between justice of all forms and climate. I think that something that is really at the heart, and it's unfortunately at the heart of, it's at the heart of the problem, and it's really also making it extremely difficult, I think we have to acknowledge, to get the world together. And we also are meeting maybe appropriate enough just ahead of this climate summit, virtual climate summit that Joe Biden has called once again, where the US sort of tries to assert some kind of climate leadership after having screwed around for several years and really actively, arguably, tried to undermine the rest of the world in dealing with climate change. And then we sort of come in and say, oh, but we're really good guys and we really want to solve this problem, and please help us out. And I think that, I do think that I'm going to give the administration the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to say that they do really want to do the right thing, as it were. But I think this question of, who is really a good actor in a situation as messed up as this one, as profoundly dangerous as the one we're in, is really, can't be exaggerated. And that the mistrust, between the global North and the global South over climate change and over so many other issues is really a huge problem. And the US, unfortunately, has been not helpful in this problem, but really harmful in this problem. So, taking the even bigger lens, I suppose, of not even national politics, but international politics, which unfortunately, you have to do with an issue like climate change, which will only be solved on a global level. We really need to take, a hard look at ourselves. And every 2 or 4 years, we kind of do that, and then we look away. And so that's not helpful. How's that? I'll just end there.
Yeah, Betsy, you've anticipated my follow-up question here, which is, of course, about the White House Summit, the Earth Day Summit that begins on Thursday virtually. Of course, the president has invited the heads of government from reportedly from 40 countries around the world to come to a virtual meeting where they will try to get the Paris Agreement process back on track in advance of the next big United Nations sponsored meeting in November, where the Paris Agreement targets are scheduled to be strengthened. I work with the organization Covering Climate Now, as was mentioned, and we work with hundreds of news organizations around the world to improve their coverage of climate change. I must say that I have been slightly disappointed, more than slightly disappointed, in a lot of the US media coverage of the Biden approach here, which sort of implicitly acts like the United States is the leader here. And we're the ones who, John Kerry went around the world to urge other countries to be more ambitious, which is just such a misreading of the history on this issue. So let's talk a little bit about that North-South disparity, Bill. You've been on a lot of these international conferences. How well do you think the Biden administration understands what Betsy was just talking about with that level of really a level of distrust from the rest of the world? Even as they welcome Biden, they are afraid that the US political system could, as it did for the last 4 years, backtrack. What do you see coming out of this coming week?
Well, look, as Betsy says, we have great, almost a duty to do all we can to kind of cheer on the Biden administration as they're seem to be seriously trying to take this on. But your larger point, Mark, is very well taken. And your work at Covering Climate Now has been so important because, among other things, it's broadened dramatically globally the conversation here. And so many of your partners in this are on other continents and other places. Here's a way to think about it, or two ways to think about it. We're used to this idea, Americans are used to the idea that they're the leader in all good things, but in fact, it's a complete reflection of the dysfunction of our political system that we're even kind of in the negotiating, in the kind of trenches the way we are. If you ask yourself why the Paris Climate Accord is an accord, not a treaty, why it's not binding, why it's a series of voluntary pledges, the answer to that has everything to do with the fact that about 15 years ago, the rest of the world figured out that there were never going to be 2/3 of the US Senate willing to back a serious treaty on climate change, that the oil and gas industry would always control at least 1/3 of the US Senate. So it was pointless to try and have a treaty that the US would never approve. So we went to this whole other business of, voluntary pledges and things. And if you ask who's really made a difference, I write this newsletter every week for the New Yorker on climate stuff, and tomorrow's is about sort of the best thing that got us to where we are now, which came not at all from the US. It came from the smallest, most vulnerable nations around the world. And what it was, you'll remember, both Mark and Betsy, that beginning in about 1995 or 96 or so, the world, for no particularly good reason, started talking about 2 degrees Celsius as the target, the red line that we weren't going to go past, so on and so forth. But sometime about 10 years after that, the poorest, most vulnerable countries on Earth, especially the small island nations, began to say, no, that's not good enough. Pretty clear from the science now that two degrees will melt enough of the poles to put us underwater and take us out entirely. And so at the Copenhagen summit in 2009, I remember joining in the first chants led by some African and Caribbean organizers, 1.5 to stay alive. And at the time, it was just a small group of people, but people kept pushing it. And by the time we got to Paris, it was included in the preamble of the Paris Climate Accord, sort of as a sop to organizers. We'll put this number in here where it doesn't mean anything, 1.5. And meanwhile, we've got all our pledges in the body of the text. And if you do those, they'll add up to a world where the temperature goes up 3 degrees, 3.5 degrees Celsius, something like that. But that 1.5, including it in the official declaration from Paris, proved pivotal because all of a sudden scientists started studying what we need to do. And what they emerged with was the set of deadlines that are now driving an awful lot of action, governmentally and non-governmentally. What the IPCC, the world's authorities on scientific authorities on climate, told us in 2018 was that to meet that 1.5 degree target, we would need, or to come anywhere close to it, we would need to cut emissions in half by 2030. And so finally we had a real deadline, almost a literal deadline to work with. And that has driven so much of what we're seeing now in the finance sector. It's driven so much of what's going on. So thank the smallest, poorest nations on Earth for driving the rational part of this debate. And one of the interesting things is this stuff this week is a prelude to the Glasgow climate negotiations that'll take place in November, probably the most important climate meeting since Paris. But one of the questions is whether enough of the poor countries of the world, their delegations will be vaccinated in time to be able to attend the meeting. And our colleague and dear friend Greta Thunberg said last week, she's going to boycott Glasgow unless everybody can be there. And it's precisely because, it's not just a question of abstract justice, it's precisely because it's the people whose countries and lives are actually on the line as we're dealing with this that have come up with the right answers over and over and over again.
Really quick follow-up before I turn to Betsy on that. You referenced Greta Thunberg's statement that she is going to boycott the Glasgow meetings in November. And therefore, I've read some analysts saying, well, I think then that it's going to lead to a delay of, or I should say a postponement of the meeting until 2022. Is that really the right way forward? Can we really delay a meeting that you just said is,
No, the right way forward is to make sure you vaccinate the 30,000 people that are going to go there. But it's a great reminder that, we're repeating the same things with vaccine inequity that we're repeating, that we've seen with carbon inequity, and shame on us. It's as stupid as Betsy pointed out a minute ago. You're definitely not going to solve the climate crisis one country at a time, nor, as it turns out, are you going to solve the pandemic one country at a time. The last thing we need is a kind of pandemic apartheid, but the climate negotiations are, it's an easy, we got 20,000 people, you got to get shots in their arms. That should be at the easiest possible end of what we need to do.
Betsy, I want to get into your book a bit here, and I'm going to do it by referencing the previous president, who basically spent 4 years steering the United States in the wrong direction on climate, and therefore, really just in terms of science, it just gets harder and harder. The longer you go in that direction, when we really need to be speeding in this direction, makes it very difficult, not just for what we discussed earlier, the rest of the world's trust of the United States, but rather simply getting to the level that you can imagine limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So in your book, you describe all kinds of efforts to manipulate nature. And one of them that I think is the one that gave the title for the book, Under a White Sky, is this idea that we're going to magically cool off the Earth by shooting little objects up into the sky that will turn it white. Is that, would you have written that, and would that have been quite as much of a purported solution to the climate crisis if we had not been going backwards at such a rate during the last 4 years?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that, you know, this idea of solar geoengineering, and one of the interesting things about writing the book, actually, which I really was not aware of until I delved into it a bit, was that as soon as we came up with the idea, I mean, when I say we, I mean scientists, back in the 60s, when the very first, you know, report to President Lyndon Johnson included a chapter on climate change. And the basics of climate change were understood because it's pretty basic physics, you know. They immediately jumped to, well, they jumped right over, let's cut carbon. They jumped right to, let's dump a lot of reflective stuff in the oceans. And that, well, and you can go back, you can find this report online. It's a very famous report from 1965. We're just gonna, you know, and they costed it out. It's like, well, it's sort of cheaper to do that. You know, we'll just dump this reflective stuff in the ocean, and that will counteract climate change. And that idea didn't really, you know, take off, as it were, to use a bad pun. But a few years later, just a few years later, a Russian scientist proposed this idea of mimicking volcanoes, which, you know, as we know, have a cooling effect, a temporary cooling effect, by shooting a lot of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, which sort of makes these clumpy little droplets that reflect sunlight back to space. And so we get beautiful sunsets and we get this cooling effect. And that idea has stuck around since the 70s, and it's always been sort of percolating in the background. And, you know, a combination of Donald Trump, but really more profoundly, simply, you know, inaction, you know, where we are today, speeding, you know, away from 350 parts per million, you know, almost as fast as we can, is always going to hang in the background. I don't think you're ever getting rid of that conversation, you know, because the sad fact is that we don't have any way, we don't have very many tools in our armament. If we get a climate, if we get a true humanitarian disaster or ecological disaster, because of the geophysics of climate change, we just don't have any tools to roll that back, to reverse that. And so I think that this idea, which is extremely controversial and should be extremely controversial, is never leaving us. We're never, you know, it's never going away. I can't tell you how it's going to play out, but I can tell you that there was, just after the book came out, a National Academies report saying we should have $100 million research agenda on geoengineering, and they very, very carefully, you know, phrased it. This should not be a substitute for reducing emissions, which we have to do, but we've gotten ourselves into a pretty bad jam up, and we might want to know whether this would even work or not. So I think you're just going to hear more and more about this, and I definitely think Donald Trump, you know, didn't help the trajectory that we're on, but I can't entirely blame Donald Trump, I'm afraid.
Betsy, it's fascinating that you mentioned both the United States scientists and Russian scientists who came up with this idea. So it simply won't do to say, oh, this is just American arrogance. But there is something that the US and Russia do share, which is that they are both petrostates. And so, Bill, I'd like you to speak a little bit to that, to the role of big oil. You mentioned earlier that the rest of the world had figured out that big oil was always going to have a stranglehold over the United States Senate sufficient to prevent a treaty. Can you talk a little bit about that and so much of the work that you and other activists with 350 and the rest of the movement have done to try and weaken the hold of big oil, not only in Washington, by the way, in state capitals, but also arguably even more importantly on Wall Street? How's that going, and what do you expect going forward?
Absolutely, I'd love to, but I want to just first say, I was so glad that Betsy was talking about her book. And I really, really want to just remind people what a fine piece of reporting it is. It's good we're talking at a library. Libraries are really good. I love the fact that everybody can go in and get stuff for free. But when new books come out, people need to buy them. And so people should buy Betsy's book.
Thank you, Bill.
In a big way. So look, one of the things the mystery, the greatest of mysteries about the climate crisis is scientists told us 30 years ago now that we faced the crisis, and nothing has significantly changed since then. It's not like we've developed some new understanding of it. I wrote the first book about it, but you could pretty much reprint the book today and it's science is fine. Scientists told us what to do, and they told us basically what to do about it. It's not like there's been any huge mystery. We need to stop burning coal and gas and oil and start putting renewable energy in instead. And right at the beginning, when this was first an issue, it's kind of everybody understood that. I mean, since we're talking in Connecticut, let's raise a glass to George H.W. Bush, who was president at the time that all of this was first coming out. And George H.W. Bush said, "We will fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect," and which is a pretty good line. And why wouldn't you? Because the scientists told you the worst thing in the world is happening. Of course, we go to work on it. But then we didn't go to work on it, and we know now why. Great investigative reporting over the last 5 or 6 years. LA Times, Inside Climate News, Columbia Journalism School has, beyond any doubt now, made it clear that the fossil fuel industry, A, knew absolutely everything there was to know about climate change back in the 80s. And why wouldn't they? I mean, Exxon was then the biggest company on Earth. It had great scientists. Its product was carbon. Of course, they were going to understand, try to figure out what was going on. And they did. Their scientists by 1982 were predicting with uncanny accuracy what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020. They got it spot on. And they were believed. The CEOs of places like Exxon started building all their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was on the way. But they didn't tell the rest of us. Instead, they, across the industry, began devoting large sums of money to building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that's kept us locked in paralysis for 30 years. So, we went from George H.W. Bush saying what he said to Donald Trump, Republican president, announcing that it's all a hoax and it's going to start getting cold soon. In order to win, a way of saying it is, we won the argument early on. Scientists and journalists, everybody else, managed, win the argument, but we didn't win the fight because the fight wasn't about data and reason. It was about money and power. And so in an effort to win that fight, a lot of us have spent the last 15 years trying to build movements that have some chance of counterbalancing the power of the fossil fuel industry. And some of the ways we've gone about that are governmental, and you can see them taking shape in the Green New Deal and things. But a lot of it, as you say, has been going directly at the financial power of the fossil fuel industry. So this divestment movement that we launched a decade ago is now at about $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel, including most of the great universities of the world, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of California system, on and on and on. And it's been very effective. And now it's morphing into a really strong assault on the banks, asset managers, and insurance companies that, all of which are important Connecticut industries, that are the financial lifeline for this rogue industry trying to profit off the end of the earth. My last trip out before pandemic lockdown was to go to jail in DC at the headquarters, the the branch of Chase Bank nearest the capital, because JP Morgan Chase is literally the biggest lender in the world to the fossil fuel industry. They've sent them $250 billion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. So yeah, Donald Trump did what he could to screw things up, but these guys were happy to sabotage it themselves, you know? And with that kind of pressure, and there'll be lots more once everybody's got a shot in their arm, we're beginning to see small signs of change. All the big banks have now committed to net zero by 2050, which is, well, no one actually has any idea what it is, except that it's, 5 CEOs away from now. So it seems comfortable. And so we'll be pushing them a lot harder, mostly to stop lending money to the industry that's using it to prolong its business model another couple of decades. And if they're able to, they'll break the planet in the meantime, because time is the one thing we don't have.
That's Bill McKibben, folks. He is the author of Falter and many other books on climate change, the environment, and many other aspects of political and social life. And we're also here talking with Elizabeth Kolbert. She is the author of the new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. I want to pick up here, and my name is Mark Hertsgaard. I'm with Covering Climate Now in The Nation magazine. Betsy, I want to pick up here on something that we're talking about, not just the financial and political power of the oil industry, but also something you talk about a lot in this book, which is modern society's faith in techno fixes. That somehow we can fix everything. So, the Exxon CEO, Lee Raymond, who said years ago, well, if the temperatures go up, we will just adapt. We're engineers, we can adapt to this. And I was struck in your book, and I'd love you to just tell in thumbnail the story of coral, because when we talk about the difference between 1.5 degrees of temperature rise and 2 degrees of temperature rise, one of the big impacts of that difference is going to be on the world's coral around the world. And you discovered some potentially heartening aspects to that are also a little more complicated. So tell us a little bit about that. And
yeah, sure. So that's really the story that sort of got me. I wrote a story on for the New Yorker. That's the story that really, it's at the center of the book, but it really is the beginning of why I chose to write the book. And it was a project called this, that was nicknamed very quickly, the Super Coral Project. And the idea behind it was pretty simple. It was that the oceans are, really, I'll use the technical term, messed up. They're warming very quickly. You shouldn't really be able to warm the oceans, when you think about how much volume is in the oceans, but we've managed to do that. And, most of the heat really that's trapped on planet Earth by greenhouse gases is going into the oceans. And likewise, we're basically funneling a lot of CO2 into the oceans, and that's acidifying the oceans, just because when CO2 dissolves in water, it's an acid. And one group of organisms that we know is really unhappy with these changes is corals. Coral reefs are just doing really badly. The Great Barrier Reef has lost something like 50% of its coral cover in the last 30 years. So it's really a tragedy of epic proportions. And coral reefs, I'm not going to give everyone the little lesson on how important coral reefs are, because I'm sure everyone knows it. But the basic fact is, a quarter of marine organisms spend at least part of their life cycle on a coral reef. So if you lose coral reefs, and they have been lost in the past, and this gets back to the issue of mass extinction, it's some of the worst crises in the history of life. So these scientists, two women scientists, had this idea, well, if you want coral reefs, if we want our grandkids to see coral reefs, if we want coral reefs to survive this century, and if we can kind of hope that this century is the century of maximum human impacts, we're going to have to go in and sort of tweak reefs somehow. We're going to have to reinvent reefs. And people have come up with all sorts of ideas, especially for the Great Barrier Reef, that range from this idea of assisted evolution, which is sort of hybridizing corals to try to find hardier varieties, and probiotics for coral reefs, and robotic receding of coral reefs and brightening clouds over coral reefs. The list is very long, and there's a big report from the Marine Park Authority that takes, supposedly oversees the Great Barrier Reef. But the question here, which is the question that hangs over all of these technological fixes in the book, and I would argue all of the technological fixes in the world, is, are they really going to work? And B, scale. We are messing around with things on such a profound scale. So even if you could come up with a hybridized coral that was more heat tolerant, the Great Barrier Reef's the size of Italy. So these are really the questions that, unfortunately, once again, I think we're going to confront more and more and more. How are we going to intervene again, try to intervene again, because we don't feel we have any choice. Otherwise we're just going to watch coral reefs disintegrate. And are we capable? Are we really genuinely capable of intervening in ways that are really going to make a difference or not? And that is kind of a big question mark, I would argue.
Well, there's always the law of unintended consequences, isn't there?
Well, there sure is. And definitely, the book deals with a lot of interventions that have, gone awry and that we're, now dealing with. And climate change, you could argue, is the ultimate one. It was an unintended one. We didn't intend to change the entire climate, but we managed to do it nevertheless. And now you could argue, I guess, in 2021, once again, I would say we're not doing it intentionally, but we're doing it knowingly now.
I want to pick up on that theme by referencing an article that we published this week, actually last week now, for Covering Climate Now. It ran in the Nation magazine and also the Guardian and a number of other places, by Professor Harold Wanless, who is at the University of Miami, and our colleague Jeff Goodell, the great climate writer at Rolling Stone magazine and the author of many books, was the one who first turned me on to Wanless's work. And I worked with him on this article, and he contends, Professor Wanless, who is an expert in geology and sea level rise records historically, he says that precisely because, as you mentioned, Betsy, most of the heat from excessive global warming is now in the oceans, 93% of it actually. So we have so heated up the oceans, argues Professor Wanless, that now 20 feet minimum of sea level rise is locked in on this planet. And the only question is whether that happens over 2,000 years or over 200 years. And of course, as you can guess, we're right now on the trajectory of 200 years, which maybe doesn't sound so serious until you parcel it out and you realize that means 3 feet of sea level rise by 2040 to 2050. And here in California, where I'm speaking to you from, 3 feet of sea level rise would put most of the Bay Area's coast underwater. Back there in the East Coast, New York City, all 3 of New York City's airports, runways would be underwater. Don't even ask about New York's subways. In southern Florida, where Professor Wanless lives, that would mean the end of fresh water supplies, et cetera, et cetera. So Professor Wanless argues, being a scientist, and probably not having read your book, Betsy, that the only solution to this is for humans to figure out ways to massively extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's not enough to just lower the emissions, although he says that's essential. But beyond that, in order to cool off the oceans, we have to extract massive amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere. That seems to me to be the ultimate technical fix, and the challenge that you raise in your book. On the one hand, nobody wants to see 20 feet of sea level rise. On the other hand, can we really do that? Should we really do that? What's your take on that?
Well, as they say, there's a chapter in the book about that. There's a chapter in my book about carbon dioxide removal, and once again, you're going to be hearing more and more about that because Bill, when he went looking for a name, I've heard Bill tell this story, and it's a great story for 350.org. It was something that everyone could understand in any language, and it was the figure that Jim, well, I shouldn't be telling Bill's story, but anyway, I will briefly tell it, the figure that Jim Hansen gave for the parts per million in the atmosphere that he considered safe. Now we just hit 420 the other day. So, obviously we're moving, very rapidly in the wrong direction, and we're going to continue to move in the wrong direction. This is unfortunately a really key point. Not when we slow the rate of CO2 emissions, not when we cut our emissions, and this is why you keep hearing net zero. We're only going to reach a new climate equilibrium, and not right away when we hit net zero emissions. So that's why net zero is so important. And when you think of net zero, the reason why we keep saying net zero is because it's very, very, very hard, even under the best of circumstances, to decarbonize a lot of things like concrete and steel. And we don't need to get into the details, but we're going to need, I think most people have come to believe, scientists, some kind of carbon removal always to net out what we're going to continue to put in there. Now, the question of whether that's possible, once again, we have sort of committed our future to these technologies that we don't know if they will work or work at scale. We certainly know how to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's not hard. Can we do it at scale? Can we do it without huge energy costs, without huge infrastructure? These are all the questions that are before us. And I want to say, if our lives depended on taking billions and billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, could we do it? Once again, very open question.
Let me turn to Bill in a second here and just emphasize that Professor Wanless, actually, Bill, says 350 is not enough, that we actually have to go down closer to the pre-industrial level of 280. He says this will take a while, but also regarding Betsy's point, even if we get to net zero, that doesn't lower the temperature on the planet. The planet stays hot enough to melt all that ice. So can you speak to this, and especially speak to the point that a lot of climate activists instinctively reject the idea of carbon removal as they see it as a substitute for cutting emissions. And let me underline that Wanless says, no, we need both. We need emissions cuts, but we also need massive removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. So what's your take on that, Bill?
Well, I think that the right way to think about it is what we do now. Right now, we can't do massive removal of carbon from the atmosphere. We don't have the technology. If you wanted to do it, you couldn't. There's not people are building small prototype equipment to show proof of concept, but that doesn't, we're many, many, many years away from being able to do this. So what we have to do now is take the technology we currently have and deploy it at absolute maximum speed. And that technology is solar panels, windmills, and the batteries that go with them. That's now, thanks to the engineering of the last 10 or 15 years, the cheapest power on Earth. So the job between now and 2030 is to deploy the hell out of that stuff and start, stop the flow of, water into this bathtub. And then also during this decade, it'd be a good idea to be working on the technology that we're going to need afterwards. But the point is, we'll never need that technology if we don't do the work we have to do in the next 10 years. We can't win this fight between now and 2030, but we can definitely lose it, because if we don't radically decrease emissions immediately, we're going to go past a series of tipping points from which there is no return, no matter what thing you invent going forward. So I don't know. Environmentalists sometimes are characterized as Luddite or whatever, but I don't think there's anything to that at all. I think people are eager to deploy the technologies that we have on hand, and are very grateful to the engineers who've done amazing work to make this the cheapest power on Earth. Our problem now is just the political blockage of the fossil fuel industry that wants to keep doing what it's doing for another couple of decades. And, that's the fight. But yes, obviously, we should be researching the hell out of that, and we should be working hard on the natural ways to do this too, which include trying to figure out what's possible with soils. We're beginning to get more sense of what some kind of regenerative agriculture or something might look like, but it's really early in that game and we don't know a lot about it. So there's a ton of good work to be done. But none of that matters if between now and 2030 we don't radically change what our energy system looks like so we can bend this carbon curve quickly.
That's Bill McKibben. He writes about those tipping points that he just referenced in his latest book, Falter. And we are also speaking with Elizabeth Kolbert about her book, which I keep holding up here to make sure that all of you try to buy it. If you've already bought it, buy one for a friend or buy one to donate to another local library. We all believe in libraries here as authors. We are very grateful for them, and we're grateful for all of you to be here tonight. We're going to segue now to some questions from some of the local high school students. And I just want to, on the way, point out that someone did ask in the chat, and you may ask further questions here in the chat if you like. Someone did ask about soil and the power of soil, which Bill just touched on to draw carbon down. It's interesting and I think encouraging that the Biden administration seems to recognize that possibility. When Joe Biden was running for president over a year ago and he went to the Iowa caucuses, he talked about how farmers can be part of the climate solution by paying, by changing the incentive structure there to help them store carbon in the soil, which was a very important and encouraging departure. So I'm going to just ask a couple of questions here, or I should say relay them. And forgive me, students, if I somehow get your names wrong. I'm doing my best here. But there's one question that has been asked about by 4 or 5 different students here, and I'll give it to both, first to Betsy and then to Bill, is essentially, what do we do? What do we who as young people know about this problem and care about this problem, how can we be most effective in making solutions happen in time? Betsy Kolbert first.
Well, I think that, you know, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I should say that, as Bill said, we need major changes and we need a political system that is going to carry that out. So we need all young people to, as soon as possible, you know, register to vote and get out there and make their voices heard. And also, as Bill alluded, there has been, you know, a really significant, powerful youth movement that I think really has changed the conversation about climate change. And for that, we should all be grateful. So, you know, all young people should see that their voices have had an impact and should, you know, join that tremendous, the voting bloc of the future. How's that? So that is answer number one. And answer number two, I think, does involve, you know, modeling behaviors that we're going to need in a new world. And I guess we're talking to, you know, people who I guess high school students from Connecticut, the things that, you know, where are our big carbon emissions coming from? Well, you know, instead of getting a car, you know, for graduation, get a bike. How's that? There are ways that we are going to need to all live differently, I think, to make the changes that we need. We need huge policy changes, and those changes are going to have ramifications that we're all going to have to embrace. And I think that by modeling that, young people and thinking about ways to live differently in the future, young people can really move this conversation forward politically and also socially. So both of those, I think, are really important messages.
Bill?
Yeah, Betsy, as usual, is exactly right. Look, we're past the point where you can sadly, we're past the point where you can solve the math of climate change one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time, whatever. It's now going to require serious economic and political shifts in order to give us any chance. And what that means, I think, if you think about it, if you're whatever age you are, the most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make change. Now, young people are doing this in a terrific way. The youth climate movement's the most vibrant and important part of the climate movement now around the world. And you can tell, I mean, Joe Biden would not be doing what he is doing right now, were it not for the Sunrise Movement, which is all people under 30 and almost all people who cut their teeth on these campus divestment campaigns. before they emerged to, sponsor the Green New Deal and things. And they're being, trailed, just the next generation is just as good. The young people around the world who organized climate strikes in every corner of things did an immense amount to get momentum moving in the right direction. So it's really important to keep that organizing up. And then it's really important to figure out how to make sure your parents, and maybe even more importantly, your grandparents, are doing some stuff about this. Are not, on their own homes, sure, but more importantly, in the world. I'm doing an increasingly amount of sort of organizing with older Americans on the theory that they've become a kind of political and financial block, an obstacle to change. And we need the same kind of spirit now that we're seeing animate young people. Young people have a very particular reason to worry about this. It's their lives that are going to get most crunched. But older people have a good reason to worry about it too, because, grandchildren.
Let's have one more question about students, focused particularly on them, not just what they can do to affect this, but a number of them have asked, what can I do to prepare myself for my future career? Caring about this, but also having to make a living as I grow up. Let's go back to you, Betsy.
Well, I often, before COVID hit, I often spoke at colleges and universities, and I would say, the upside of down is there. If you're interested in clean energy, in engineering the world of the future, all of our major cities, unfortunately, as Hal Wanless, and I spent a long time with Hal Wanless in Miami a few years ago, and he's a great character. He keeps he went to Greenland, and he keeps a vial of water from the Greenland ice sheet in the little refrigerator, in his office, I guess, as a reminder of, there's a lot there where that came from. A lot of all of our coastal cities are going to have to be re-engineered. There's an endless amount of work, of that will need to be done. That will be interesting work, I hope. And I hope that we have, our act together enough to do the work. How's that? And so if you're looking for what you can do, both in a professional way and also participating in, this great massive project of remaking our world, hopefully for the better, there will be a place for you. I think that clean energy, clean tech finance, engineering, those are all fields that are going to be, hiring for the foreseeable future.
Let me get in another question here. We're coming down to the last 5 minutes. This is from Jack, a high school student, who says, it seems as though the policies for environmental issues vary with the political party that dominates that particular state. Is there any way to make environmental issues non-political? Bill McKibben.
Well, as I was saying before, there was a moment when they were non-political to a very large extent. And that moment changed because the fossil fuel industry decided to make it change. And the fossil fuel industry, in the guise of people like the Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons, purchased themselves a political party and scared the hell out of the other party. And that's been enough to stop action dramatically. Literally, it's only now with this infrastructure plan that Biden has put forward that we're seeing the first real large-scale congressional action possible on climate change in the whole global warming era. And if it passes, it'll pass on a party line vote by one senator. So I don't think there's a way in the short run to avoid a certain amount of political polarization within the kind of political structure. But that said, there are plenty of ways to get people more engaged in this fight across the political spectrum. When we do polling, one of the things we find is that the thing that polls highest among Republicans, Democrats, and independents of any topic we bring up is more support for solar panels and solar energy. Everybody loves it. I think they may like it for different reasons. My sense is that conservatives are kind of like the idea that you got a solar panel on your roof and then your house is your fortress. And I think liberals like, the groovy power of the sun is running my life, and on and on. Who cares? I mean, we can work with that. So there are places to do that kind of work. They're just at the moment not in the Congress or often in state legislatures because they've been bought, and that's just the sad reality of the moment we happen to live in. But man, it is inspiring to see the Biden administration at least trying in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think that as we begin to see successes from all of this, as people see their energy bills starting to go down, on and on and on, then support will begin to build everywhere. The job of activists, of anybody who cares about this, in the end, is to change the zeitgeist, the sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. And that's beginning profoundly to shift, and we have to accelerate that shift with everything we can.
Change the zeitgeist, folks. That's your homework for tonight. One last quick question. We have literally 1 minute for Betsy Kolbert on this before I have to take us out. This is a question from student Matt C. I don't know your last name, Matt. I apologize. Matt says, I learned earlier this year that by 2050, the cumulative weight of plastic in the ocean will be greater than the cumulative weight of fish in the ocean. As someone who grew up fishing with my father, will I ever have the opportunity to take my own children fishing, and what will it take to protect the fish species that still exist?
Wow, that's a big question for 1 minute. Plastic in the oceans is a really serious problem. There's no doubt about it, and the figures are horrific. And I think it's another example, and this is kind of, you could say, a cop-out, but unfortunately it's the truth, where we need really profound, systemic change. Once again, not, banning plastic bags as they did in where I live, that's a great start, but we really need to look at all forms of plastic packaging and waste. And it also gets back to the idea that, we were sort of hooked on plastic with the idea of, oh, well, we could recycle it. And we now realize that we can't recycle it. We're not recycling it. And we need to start looking at that again, unfortunately. Another task for you young people from the bottom up. So, there's a lot of work to be done. That I feel can be done. People lived without plastic, for millennia, and we can do it again. But it's another thing where we really need really major changes in the way we think about things and the way what we value, really. I mean, we get down to basics of convenience. Why do we waste a lot of plastics? I'm not a plastics, scientist, but a lot of it needs to be rethought.
And Matt, if you're interested, or anyone who's interested in working on this issue, some of the best, most aggressive work on plastics is being done by Greenpeace USA, which is going after the fossil fuel companies. It's ironic that the fossil fuel companies actually are the ones who are making most of that plastic. And indeed, as they see—
And it's all made from fossil fuels.
Made from fossil fuels, comes out of petroleum, folks. And as Exxon and Chevron and all that bunch see their prospects, economic prospects, declining because of the work of Brother McKibben and others to shut down the money supply, what do? No, they're not going into green energy. Sorry to disappoint you. They are actually hoping to save themselves by increasing the amount of plastic they produce. Greenpeace is on that case. If you want to join that fight, they're the place to go. It is now my reluctant duty to bring this to a close. Let me end by thanking both of our distinguished panelists tonight. Bill McKibben, whose latest book is Falter and is the head of, or emeritus head of 350.org, and really the godfather, if I may say, Bill, of all climate writing here in the United States, since he wrote his first classic book, The End of Nature, in 1989, if I recall correctly. And then also Elizabeth Kolbert, who is the author of the new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future, which Everyone should read and buy a copy for a friend and for a friendly library. And thanks finally to everyone who is supporting the Greenwich Library, to Peggy Kolb and Kathy Seehey, who have arranged tonight's program. Everyone, support your local library. This is the kind of public dialogue that libraries foster, and they need your support to continue to thrive. We thank you very much for everything. My name is Mark Hertsgaard. I'm with Covering Climate Now and The Nation magazine, and we wish you a very pleasant evening.